It's great to have you all here and um, um, to see so many uh, known and friendly names. So I will do a presentation in two parts. In the first part, I will do a quick overview of what the data are and what they include. And in the second part, I will show how the search tools work and what you can sort of hope to get from the searches themselves. So let me start by sharing the presentation screen. Please share. Yes, all right. I am now sharing, hopefully, my presentation screen. So the PACS Peace Agreements database can be found on our website, which is very easy to remember. So it's peaceagreements.org. The website has a lot of features, and I will be going through a good deal of them today. We also at the PSRP curate and work on the politicalsettlements.org website, which covers all the work of the entire program and the program consortium. But let me start with the PACS data. So there are three PACS databases, essentially. There's the main PACS, which contains 1,868 peace agreement documents from 1990 to June 2020, with all full texts available. And then the two sub-databases are the gender PACS and local PACS. These are fully subsets of the main database. That means that there's nothing in them that isn't also in the main database. So anything that deals with women in any way gets also put into the gender PACS. Anything, any agreement that is local in nature gets also sort of rooted into the local PACS. I would also like to note that there are two additional data sources that can be accessed via the peaceagreements.org website. The Amnesty's database, Professor Louise Mallander's data, on which she will be giving a presentation in one of our webinars next week. And there is also the COVID-19 ceasefires database that is also produced in collaboration with multiple academic and practitioner partners. But today, the focus is the main PACS database, which originates from the work of Christine Bell sort of back in the sort of early 2000s with original versions from 2008, if I'm not mistaken. The PSRP and the University of Edinburgh have been hosting the data since 2015, and the database has seen multiple new releases. The PSRP teams is now working on the 5th release of the PACS database and data set. The most recent one was in June, and we tried to be very current. So we tried to include agreements that had been agreed and signed up to June 2020. So you can see some of the most recent products of peace negotiations in the PACS database. The database covers all agreements from armed conflicts and violent crises, which are also publicly available, formal, written, and clearly agreed. So it does not matter if an agreement is covering one issue or any issue that you can imagine as the topic of peace deals. What matters is that the sides in a conflict or violent crisis agree to something, and that they do this formally and that they do this publicly. The conflicts and violent crisis also need to reach a sort of seriousness threshold. We keep a criterion of 25 battle-related deaths in any year of the conflict as the threshold for inclusion of agreements that are agreed post hoc. There is also a time limit. So agreements are included if they aim to resolve these conflicts, even if they are concluded up to 50 years after the fighting has subsided. Thus, for example, PACS includes the final agreement regarding the status of Germany stemming from the Second World War. And this is the Treaty on the Final Settlement with respect to Germany, which was signed in 1990. However, If, say, Japan and Russia were to sign the treaty that would formally end World War II today, that would not be included because the 50-year threshold would not apply. However, these examples of very long time spans between conflict and a formal agreement, they're very rare. So that's just something to keep in mind. The PAX data have global coverage, as you can see on this map. Now, this is a map of internal conflict only, partly because this is a sort of very good way to show which contexts have been producing a lot of formal agreements. And note that this map and the agreements presented in it are not indicators of conflict. They're the indicators of sort of production of agreement documents. So Colombia and Philippines, as you can see in this map, are dealing with difficult conflicts, and they are producing probably the most agreements alongside Bosnia and Herzegovina in our collection. But this is not an indicator of the intensity of conflict. The agreements are collected from, as I said, anywhere in the world where conflict and peace negotiations are ongoing. And we collect agreements through all the sources we can muster. So from Twitter, from official websites, from photos that people are sharing on social media after agreements are signed, from archives, from newspapers, from published volumes, you name it. We've probably covered that in our sources of the documents in PAX. We do try to verify documents that we come across and engage colleagues who are country experts to help us out with verification. The bulk of the documents in the PAX database have been sort of sourced in official English translations. However, about a third of them, actually a little less than a third of them, have been translated from their original language. All agreements have been digitized, they've been categorized, and they've been coded for content. So we determined for each substantive issue whether the document sort of provides for it or not. The agreements, as I said, are collected from 1990 onwards. And what you can see from this particular graph, this is a graph of regional distribution of agreements over time. What you can see is that there's no uniformity, but we are seeing some clear trends. So for example, this sort of bluish gray area in the early 90s clearly shows that the bulk of the peace negotiations in that period was taking place in countries that were in wars of essentially stemming from post-communist transition and disintegration of multinational countries such as Yugoslavia and the USSR. In the 2000s, we see a dominance of agreements in Africa and a significant increase in documents coming from the Asia Pacific region. Now, let me move on to the core features of the data provision mechanisms. So the website, the search tool, and the results. I'm going to briefly show the screenshots of what they look like, and then I'm going to do a little show and tell on the actual website. So here you see the homepage of PAX, and it sort of represents this ideal we have of sort of trying to archive, present the agreements, and to have the data available in as many shapes and forms and formats that one may need for both informing practice and conducting research. Now, the homepage itself, the mothership of PAX, if you will, links to all these various data sources and the PAX search tools. Now, if you scroll down, there are links to various visualizations and infographics. I think I've seen among the participants our project friend, Jaume, whose students in Barcelona have also been producing wonderful visualizations. They can also be accessed through through the PACS website. Now, when you click on any of the databases, you will see a search tool that provides criteria to sort of filter through the documents, and also the lists to all the key documents, such as main definitions, code books, lists of topics covered, and so on. This is a screenshot of the simple search, but we do also offer an advanced search, and I'm going to get to that. Once a search has been conducted, the results page will be showing multiple options. Download of results in PDF, which essentially prints the screen. There will be options for exporting quantitative data at agreement level with various additional data elements that allow for data to be merged with other data sets. There's the option to export the full corpus of text. So these are all agreement texts in one comma separated file, which, by the way, we do not recommend be opened in Excel. It works best when accessed from R or Python. There's also the option to access each document PDF. So this will be a scan of the original document if the document is in English, or a PDF of the translation that was done in-house. One can also access the full coded content of the agreement and the timeline. So I will briefly show what the coded agreement page looks like. You can sort of see that it gives background information, contextual information, information on participants and parties, and then for every issue that PACS accounts for, and we do account for about 230 different substantive issues. The agreement notes whether this issue is addressed, and if it is addressed, it notes exactly what the parties have agreed in that particular instance. Now, from the results page, you can also access a timeline of the search results. So this will be a timeline of agreements based on whatever search criteria were selected. So this is particularly useful for country and peace process selection. So if you want to see, for example, all the agreements signed in Myanmar, for example, you can see them on a timeline, or you can pick a particular peace process, say in Colombia, and show that on a timeline. This is also very interesting for specific issues if one wants to know whether a topic has been the object of agreement more often now than, say, in the 90s. If one wants to see how particular topics have sort of come into fashion or fallen out of fashion, as it were, in peace negotiations. So this is where I'm going to stop sharing the slides, and I will move on to sharing particular searches. So let's see. Hopefully this will now work. Right. Can I please have a confirmation, maybe from Harriet, whether you're seeing the peace agreements homepage? Yeah, okay, thank you, Harriet. Sorry, it's multiple screens and Zoom trying to be organized. All right, so this is going to be our PACS search page. Now, as you can see, we have the links to the core documents, and then there is the search. So there's some fairly straightforward elements of the search, and then some which both the PACS team and everyone else finds complex, and I'm going to try to sort of bring a bit of light to those today. Now, region is a fairly straightforward criterion. If I wanted to see all the agreements from, say, Europe and Eurasia, that's what I would pick. Country and entity is slightly more complex than what one may typically assume, partly because we're trying to include various entities that are not recognized countries, but are often seen as a sort of indicator of of the location of the conflict. So for example, in the Armenia and Azerbaijan conflict, one may look for Nagorno-Karabakh, or one, since we're at N, might also look at Northern Ireland um, as their sort of, locations of focus. Finally, in this, at this very top of the search, there's agreement and conflict level. So this is the criterion of whether the agreement and conflict are at the same level, and if not, what the levels are. So essentially it asks, is the agreement international, internal, or local? And does it deal with a conflict that's international, internal, and local? And the reason for this amount of complexity here is that we often see, for example, interstate agreements in internal conflicts where third parties come in and sign sort of on behalf of the warring sides, sort of, which is kind of sort of the, say, the Dayton Agreement situation. And you can also see situations where there are intrastate agreements within local conflicts or very localized conflicts. So for the most part, the key categories here will be interstate agreements and interstate conflicts. So Ecuador and Peru go to war over a piece of land and water rights. The agreements they sign will be interstate agreements in interstate conflict. When a government is negotiating with rebel groups, say in Colombia, these will be intrastate agreements in intrastate conflicts. When, for example, in some conflicts, there are additional sides, international actors signing the agreements as well. These will be interstate agreements in interstate conflict. Now, I think Catherine will be talking about these a bit more, so I'll stop here. I would also want to point you to our upcoming webinar, I think early in the new year, on local agreements and pacts, where I think the local conflicts will be addressed in more detail. Now, the other search options here are fairly straightforward. You can search by agreement name. So as you can see, I searched for a customs stamps agreement. This is an agreement between Serbia and the government of Kosovo. For anyone interested, there's also the category issue and sub-issue search. So this is the substantive content of agreements. And all of the issues that are covered by our coders are grouped into categories. So there are 12 broad categories: groups, gender, state definition, governance, justice sector reform, and so on. And these will be very broad. And so each of these contains a set of issues that pertain to this category. So here, for example, governance is a category. Political parties reform is a particular issue within the governance category. But then for anyone who is further interested in the details of this, there's also the sub-issue. So is it just general political parties reform? Or are we interested in rebel groups transitioning into political parties? Now, you can combine these searches in multiple ways. You can just search for a category, or just for an issue, or just for a sub-issue, or you can search for multiple issues across categories. So this is sort of where anyone who is searching can sort of exercise a lot of freedom in approaching these matters. Now, if you're interested in everything that the data cover, I think the code book that is linked to here is a great place to start. It's primarily aimed at our quantitative data, sort of explaining what each column heading means, but it's also useful just to gain an overview of everything that you can find within the database. Finally, the free text search will show you everything that any single word or a combination of words within the data. As you can see, I've previously searched for secession, God, torture, holiday, and so on. Now, you may find that you need more options than this, and the advanced search then is the place to go. So need more options, use the advanced search. This replicates a lot of the elements of the simple search: region, country entity, agreement and conflict level, agreement name, categories, issues, sub-issues. It also provides the option to select certain dates. So you know there was a ceasefire that you read somewhere signed in 2005 in a particular country, but you're not quite sure where it is. The date might help. The more sort of detailed searches will rely on this final set of criteria. So agreement stage, conflict nature, agreement status, and peace process. When I'm asked about sort of where to start with PACS peace agreements, I usually suggest that people search for interesting things in the agreement conflict level categories, and to look at the stage sort of division of agreements. So stage essentially tells us at which point in the peace process an agreement is from. So this has to do with the function of the agreement, not the passage of time. So a peace process can sort of return to a particular stage, or rather reverse to a particular stage multiple times over time. The stages are defined as pre-negotiation, so where parties sit down and agree that they will be meeting again, that they will be talking, they will set an agenda, something like that. Additionally, there's also ceasefire. So this is where parties simply say, we are going to stop fighting. These are the terms, these are the monitoring mechanisms, the verification mechanisms, and so on. In addition to these, there's also substantive partial and substantive comprehensive agreements. Now, they cover either a part or the full scope of all provisions that may be required for some sort of post-conflict settlement. So sometimes, for example, the first post-conflict constitution will be one of these agreements that sort of cover how a polity is to function post-conflict. There's also renewal, implementation, and sort of other agreements. Renewals are fairly simple. Parties get together and say, we had an agreement last year, we wish to renew it. Implementation agreements often sort of follow from substantive agreements and outline modalities of implementation. And then other are agreements that are mixed, difficult to classify, or that are not clearly performing a specific function. Conflict nature is the next interesting category to look at here. So this asks, what is this conflict about? Is it about government? Is it about territory? Is it about government and territory? Is this an intergroup conflict within a country? So a conflict in which the state is not a part. And finally, other. And again, other is a sort of residual category that covers everything that does not neatly fit into these conflicts over government, territory, or both. Agreement status is sort of the final big category here, and I sort of want to mention it, but I don't want to frighten anyone. This asks about what the signing an agreement process was like. So you'll remember I mentioned that every single of the agreements is signed and agreed. This category outlines the modalities, and I'm happy to talk about this a bit more if anyone is interested. Just to reassure you, there are only exactly 143 agreements that are not multi-party signed or agreed. And this usually has to do with multiple parties being present, but not all of them signing, or a third party issuing a document that is vital to the process, but that is issued unilaterally by the third party or something like that. Finally, there's peace process, and this is sort of fairly straightforward. Um, there may be multiple peace processes related to a particular conflict, and this is where you are likely to find multiple peace processes. For example, in Burundi, we distinguish the local processes, Arusha and related, and 2015 and onwards processes. All right, I'm going to stop here. In the Q&A, I think I can repeat any of this and show how things work. Maybe just a final glimpse of the search results, where the exports and PDFs can be accessed and downloaded. And with this, I am stopping sharing of the screen and surrender the baton to Catherine. Thank you.
I think actually Rob is going to go next, and then I'll finish up with some research examples.
Sorry, Rob, please.
Yeah, thank you, Sanya, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. So I'll try and be quick in 10 minutes or so. So I'm just going to speak broadly about my experience of coding, talking you through some of the examples of decisions that we typically have to make, and a lot of it will sort of touch on what Sanya's spoken about. And I think in the space that we have, I'm just trying to offer up a taster of the key issues that we always try to be aware of when approaching provisions. And so broadly, this tends to be carefully reading provisions, obviously, and having a grasp of the key peace process issues around the agreement, such as inclusion, and also trying to always be aware of the wider country or process context, and if need be, carrying out additional research. So ultimately, doing all of these things as we enter the data that in the categories that Sanya showed you already, if we do all of these things broadly, it's at least a starting point, and it often helps us to make the decisions in turning provisions into data slightly easier. So some provisions we ultimately have to leave alone as well. We can't always force provisions into data categories, and so we often talk about trying not to read into provisions too much. So really, coding ultimately involves substantive decisions within what really is an imperfect or iterative process, and we have a lot of discussions with the coding team as to sort of definitions around actors, etc. So provisions we're often taking them from very distinctive contexts and complex conflict settings and peace processes as we attempt to understand them and align them into conventional peace process terms like and mechanisms, such as transitional justice or power sharing. So for example, in PACS MAME coding, if we were trying to put provisions into transitional justice or power sharing categories, naturally coding is also about understanding these mechanisms as parts of peace processes, and also recognizing that there isn't always a clear or right answer in that sense. So I'll come to that in more specific detail in examples later on when I've got some provisions from sort of past agreements that we've coded. But I think just to start with, I was going to sort of touch on some broader or like reoccurring issues that we tend to see in coding. So just to begin with, for example, in PACS local coding, grievance lists tend to be a key area of focus, and we define grievances as essentially lists or issues or grievances held by the parties in the local conflict that the agreement addresses. And in some instances, we actually have entire agreement texts which are essentially, they read as extensive expressions of grievance all the way through the text. So I think in this case, for example, if we have agreements that center around competing historical claims of different herding and farming communities, for example, in South Sudan or Nigeria, over who is the original ethnic group in a specific area and therefore claims the right to live there. So we have quite a few instances or agreements like this. And in a case like that, we find we have to be careful to take out the initial expression of grievance as and sort of allocate that as the grievance data. And then this may be the clearest reference to, for example, cattle rustling or the killing of innocents. And we then try to separate that from any further emphasis of the same grievance later on in the agreement if there's a lot of repetition, as it is common that the same grievance will be mentioned again, and maybe in more detailed ways, usually in the context of how monitoring or implementation efforts are to work, such as forming investigation committees or internal intercommunal resolution dialogues. So as long as the fundamental grievance that is driving the conflict and the basis for the agreement is coded as a line in the data, we then aim to be careful with including like every other reference to the grievance. And in this way, we have to be really focused and selective, as I mentioned. Otherwise, what we tend to find is that, you know, the entire box for grievances can end up being filled out with the entire text of the agreement. And then for someone reading the coding, that can make that quite difficult to quickly establish what the grievances fundamentally are. So that's a sort of taster of one of the big decisions that we often discuss. And then moving into another area of kind of constant consideration with PAC's local coding is the selection of the type of process an agreement is part of. So the options for data entry here in some of the selections are tick box selections. And that would be a choice between formal structured process, informal but persistent process, isolated example, or unable to establish. So for example, if I were coding a local agreement in Yemen, I would be looking, for example, to enter a process as either formal or informal, but persistent. So to make that decision, I suppose we always have to be aware of issues like the complexities of localized governing systems or the provisions that mention any supporting mechanisms like committees. And even if we're less clear, if there's less clarity around how formalized or supported the process actually was, we can always look at wider patterns of local agreements being made in the same time frame or in the same even area, geographical area, involving similar groups to the ones in the agreement that we're looking at. And this would give us at least an indication of some kind of persistent practice happening in a local area. And then we would pick the informal but persistent option. So importantly, we're always trying to provide a descriptive explanatory paragraph as to why we selected a certain option. And particularly if the choice was sort of challenging to establish or contentious in any way. And in that sense, another sort of area of deliberative decision-making that we often discuss as a team is the accurate selection and representation of actor types as well, who are involved in the agreement. And when we enter the data, we actually select from participant type, which we define as parties to the agreement. And then if we feel that there was clearly a mediator or facilitator, there's a separate selection for that. And so naturally, in any of the processes or broader conflicts in question, we know that there's a duality to the role of certain actors. So, for example, we often see texts which describe a religious or societal leader, such as a sheikh, calling parties to talks, for example. But we know that in the wider frame of the conflict, they may also function as a local armed actor or be affiliated with armed groups in the frame of the conflict. But for selecting the actual option for type of mediator facilitator in the data, we will select the option which is most representational of the capacity or the role that the actor is actually playing in specific relation to signing the agreement. So in this instance, for the sheikh calling the agreement, we would enter that as domestic religious organization or leader or other elder as a mediator, rather than presence of a local armed group, and perhaps the local armed group would be ticked under participants. And so this is just another sort of case of what we mean by trying not to overly read into provisions when we make these decisions on entering data. So hopefully just that's a brief run through, and it's beginning to come across that making all of these decisions, every single one of them requires kind of careful interpretation. And it's really about being aware of the pressures that peace processes are always trying to progress under, whilst also being careful about how we apply our pre-existing knowledge when we're making these decisions around data entries. And of course, we can always go in and adjust things and change things as we go and as new agreements come in. And so I'll just briefly speak to one other useful example in that sense from PAC's main coding. And this was an example from Nigeria. It was the Kafanchan Peace Declaration, which was a multi-party signed intercommunal dialogue agreement addressing conflict between farmers and grazers. And so this agreement had really detailed provisions about inclusion for women and girls. And importantly, part of the provisions that we entered under gender, which we define in our coding manual as any provisions which address women and girls, their inclusion or their rights. The provisions actually involve really detailed mechanisms around the implementation and the conflict management, which were also explicitly linked to stakeholders. And importantly, in this case, a women's steering committee was actually signing as a third party. So this is a good case where we have to try and view the provisions of the agreement holistically with the presence of the signatories. And that allows us to get the sort of picture of the agreement in its totality. So by ensuring that we carefully examine and code the entire agreement from start to finish, including the signatories and agreements, it kind of helps us to clarify any links between the signatories and the agreement's mechanisms. And obviously, importantly, in this case, it helps us to understand the importance of the implications around implementing inclusion provisions. And so I'll just move on to a couple of specific examples of provisions and then pass on to Catherine. So these are slightly more specific examples of past provisions that sort of I found generated interesting judgments or decisions. And so in the first example, we're in South Sudan and it's a local community reconciliation agreement within a set of post-succession agreements. And so I'll just read the provisions quickly. So the state government is to create 2 more PIAM to solve some of the conflict, and the state government is to resolve the Ye River County and Otogo County border dispute with Soka PIAM and Mukaya County. So that's kind of 2 lines of provisions, but substantively there's quite a lot to take away here, and outside research and knowledge helps guide us. So firstly, state government here is being defined in a more regional sense, and the PIAM being created are more localized administrative bodies or divisions developed as part of local governance structures. So knowing that tells us that the provision can actually be entered in the data as a reference to political institutions, which we define as a reference to any institution which regulates political contestation on a daily basis. And that's also in the code book that Sanya mentioned. But then secondly, I think what was interesting is that another data takeaway, which maybe requires slightly more outside research and knowledge around the issues in South Sudan, is actually understanding the reference to the PIAM, which were developed to actually address the management of space around ongoing border disputes in South Sudan. And so on that basis, we would actually enter that provision as territorial power sharing data as well. So that's where we would see the same provision in separate boxes, and so there's a cross reference there across the coding. And so from only 3 lines of provision, you can see that there's obviously additional knowledge added in, but we're seeing a picture which kind of speaks to the modalities of local governance in South Sudan and kind of important data takeaways in terms of how these modalities attempt to address highly localized contestation of space and conflict. And then just finally, in the second example, this is an agreement from Yemen looking at the national agreement signed between the internationally recognized government and the Southern Transitional Council. And this was an interesting case. It was a power sharing agreement attempting to relocate control of Yemen's southern territories through the restructuring of governing bodies. And so the provisions read, presenting a regular report that is transparent regarding governmental revenues and spending to the Parliament for evaluation and audit. Regional and international experts and specialists must contribute and provide necessary advice in this regard. So what I would say is this provision would go typically into the category within socioeconomic reconstruction for obvious reasons. But we decided that it also goes into corruption within the security sector. And this is based on there being enough context and knowledge about the process where it seems implicit that corruption around state funds has been part of the wider conflict and an ongoing sort of issue within the process. And so we've seen this in other cases in similar provisions from agreements in Afghanistan. And typically we see these types of specific provisions have been sort of aimed at countering corruption. So perhaps if you read that provision and you didn't know the context of the process or the issues that have been ongoing, you might not consider putting it in corruption. But Of course, in the Yemeni context, we know that there have been particular issues in southern regions, instances concerning sort of the security of state-issued currency or funds being seized and redirected by other conflict actors. So I think that's another example of sort of knowing the wider context of processes when we're coding these agreements. And so I'll stop there. That was a very sort of whistle-stop tour of PACS, and I'd be happy to field any questions at the end with Sanya and Catherine, but for now, I'll pass over to my colleague, Catherine. Thanks.
Everyone, thanks so much for coming to the webinar. So now that you have a picture of how the PACS database operates, as well as kind of all the decisions that go into coding, I'm going to walk you through a few examples of research that we've undertaken using PACS, and these are based on my research, so it's just a few possibilities. And my research tends to be very qualitative, but of course the database can facilitate a lot of quantitative research as well. So the first broad possibility is by using the coding capabilities. And as Sanya mentioned, we have particular types of agreements that are there to resolve particular types of conflict. So I undertook an analysis of interstate agreements that are used to solve intrastate disputes. And we were interested in these agreements because we wanted to understand under what circumstances outside actors would be needed to end a conflict within a state, as well as under what circumstances would outside actors be willing to sign an agreement that helps to end a conflict that is not within their own state. So in this report, and there'll be a slide that comes up that shows a link to it, as well as I'm sure they'll go in the chat as well. I used descriptive statistics to provide insights into how these agreements were, one, used across regions, and two, across conflict stages. And then using secondary literature, also looked at the circumstances under which these agreements are used. And we found a number of different reasons why they would be used. First, to support a peace process, often for self-interested reasons, for example, regional stability, and making commitments to each other for how these actors will resolve a conflict. There's also the reason of raising the reputational cost of noncompliance for the key parties to the conflict, providing alternative ways to legalize a peace agreement by making it between states as opposed to between parties within a state, dealing with multiple levels of conflict. So for instance, when there's international support to conflict actors, this was the case in Cambodia, or promoting particular norms such as human rights or the prohibition against undemocratic changes of government. And why does this matter? Well, we think it could be useful to pull up models that could work to address unresolved conflicts. And it can also help us understand, why you would pursue this type of agreement, or alternatively, perhaps why it would not be effective for a particular context. So that's just kind of one example. I've also undertaken analysis of human rights, the institutionalization of human rights. So there are national, regional, and international human rights institutions. And using the coding, we've done an analysis of when these different institutions are used. That's just one article. I'll leave that there and go on to a final example so that we have a little bit of time for questions. So another research possibility with PACS is to use the peace agreements, but to design your own coding scheme if, for instance, the data is not already covered in the existing coding. And this is something that I've been doing in an ongoing project that analyzes how the African Union and other regional bodies are negotiating their role in peace and security through the lens of peace agreements. And the bulk of this work is being done as a collaborative project with Brooke Coe from Oklahoma State University. And we've taken every agreement in the PACS database that mentions a continental or regional body in Africa or Latin America and coded it using our own coding scheme that we developed through textual analysis to understand how these organizations engage in peace agreements. either by facilitating, implementing, or monitoring an agreement. And we found the agreements where these organizations are mentioned through the keyword search feature that Sonia mentioned. And our recent piece looks specifically at the engagement of the African Union and regional economic communities in Africa, or RECs. And through this work, we're trying to understand the division of labor and peace and security practices amongst sub-regional and regional organizations in order to help us understand who has ownership over and who has authority on peace and security practices. There are, of course, a lot of components of peace and security practices, anything from conflict prevention programs to peacekeeping missions. And I'm sure everyone who's attending this webinar has seen a lot of that literature. And we're trying to use peace agreements to as kind of one component of understanding this broader picture of how division of labor plays out over a multitude of different issues. So the link to the research is in the chat, and broadly it's looked at, the African Union and the 8 recognized RECs within the African continent. And it did an analysis over time of the trends of the degree to which the African Union and RECs are engaged in peace agreements and how they are engaged and what patterns are playing out. So is one organization more dominant? Is one organization in the lead, or is there competition and cooperation between these organizations? And this feeds into, a much broader understanding of how these organizations then play a role in peace and security. So I'll leave it there so that we have a few minutes for questions. And of course, if anyone has any questions that they would like to follow up with me afterwards, I'd be happy to hear from you.